Welcome to lesson 4.6. We are still covering that time period known as the market revolution. Indeed, it was a revolution as we learned in lesson 5. This lesson is all about the social impacts and how the market revolution changed America. So let's look at the objective. You should be able to explain how and why innovation in technology, agriculture, and commerce affected various segments of American society. So, how did it change American society? Let's move on. This first key concept is about how the market revolution attracted immigrants into northern cities. And many Americans then began to move west of the Appalachian Mountains, and new settlements in Illinois and Missouri along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers came about. This immigration, because we're looking at history at a whole, this time period of period 4 through period 5 is known as the old immigration. Characteristics of old immigration. They are from Northern and Western Europe. They are fair in skin and taller. They look very similar to many other Americans. Many of them were Protestant. Some had some money on arrival. Some were literate and skilled, especially the Germans, and they predominantly came over in families. And they settled as families, and they made sure that they began to assimilate as quickly as possible. So when we look at any sort of immigration, there's push factors and pull factors. We talked a little bit about this in earlier time periods. So the push factors that prompted the old immigrants to come. In terms of the Irish, they were quite literally pushed out because of the potato famine that occurs in the 1840s. The potato famine kills off their primary food supply, leaving the land devastated, leaving the people starving. So frequently, they came not very well off. They settled mostly in northern industrial cities. The Germans were not so much as pushed, but they were pushed because of religious and political persecution. Germany was not yet a unified nation, so there was a lot of chaos. So it wasn't as drastic as the potato famine, but there were German immigrants that were pushed because of this religious and political persecution. Pull factor. What is pulling them? During the market revolution, there is a demand for working class labor in the urban factories. And this demand for working class labor was filled by the Irish. Most of the Irish settled in cities like Boston and New York. They didn't have money to leave the coastline. Another reason that pulled them was this abundance of farmland in the old Northwest Territory, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. It was very attractive to the middle class Germans who were farmers and the Scandinavians who were farmers. Many of the Scandinavians wind up settling in Minnesota, the Minnesota Vikings. So as Americans begin to adapt to these immigrants, we see a lot of Americans wanting to leave. Eastern cities were getting overcrowded with immigrants. There was less available housing, and unemployment, coupled with increasing crime and disease, pushed migrants to the West. So if you had the means, you didn't want to live in an overcrowded city. You wanted to move where you could have your own land and capture your own piece of the American dream. That's the Eastern push because the East was getting overcrowded. The Western pull. Some Americans who had money were pulled into the states of the old Northwest Territory where they could farm and be self-sufficient and be left alone. And during the market revolution time period, we see new cities in the West develop, such as Chicago, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and St. Louis, Missouri, as these immigrants pulled them away. Moving on to key concept number 2, the growth of manufacturing drives up this idea of a middle class. In America, we had the elite and we had the poor. So the market revolution shifts the class system. As I said, in colonial times and into the new nation, society was divided into the two classes. You had the small entrepreneurs, you had the upper class elite, you had New England merchants and Southern planters, and just about everybody else was poor working class, whether they were subsistence farmers or being a small shop owner. During the market revolution, the entrepreneurial upper class grew from the growth of manufacturing. However, they still remained a small proportion of the total population. The poor working class, which is now farmers, small farmers, and factory workers, is still the largest group. Keep that in mind. However, a new middle class emerges that is what that means is the office managers of these factories. You might still be an elite and own the factory. If you're working in the factory, you are the working poor. But the managers, the white collar jobs, so to speak, become this middle class. They have more of a disposable income, which means they can buy more consumer products. They also have more leisure time. So when you think of middle class, think of clerks, accountants, bankers, maybe a store owner running your own business, maybe the manager of a factory. So the middle class becomes a unique class between the elite and the working poor. The market revolution was the cause of this shift into the middle class. Our next key concept is about an economic shift, how life actually begins to change. As urban areas grow in the Northeast, what begins to happen? The small self-sufficient farmers begin to be taken over. As cities grow, they eat up more land. So farmers who used to grow subsistence crops, remember, subsistence is only enough to survive. They had to seek employment in the factories and textile mills. We call this from farm to factory, that they were self-sufficient farmers and now they are working in factories. One factory in Massachusetts in particular is a name that is a great example. It is named for a man, Robert Lowell. He creates a system that employs young girls, unmarried farm girls, as factory labor. They go to live in dormitories on the factory grounds. If you were to see this factory, Lowell, today, you can still see it. It's a giant compound. It almost looks like a university campus. The Lowell girls would live on factory grounds and they would promise to protect their purity and remain chaste while they send monies back to their family because the farms are struggling. However, once some of the Lowell girls begin to organize a strike to demand for higher wages, the system quickly begins to decline and they are replaced with Irish immigrants who did not need the costly dormitories. And the Irish would work for less because they were literally pushed out of Ireland because of the potato famine. And the last key concept, and one of the most significant, is that the whole role of women begins to shift and gender roles change, family roles change, and we separate society into the private sphere of the home and the public sphere, the world of work. So let's talk about all of this. This concept is known as the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood. It refers specifically to white middle class to upper class women. Working class Irish women were working. Slaves in the South were busy working. So just to be clear of who we're talking about, before we jump right in, let's rewind. After the Revolutionary War, if you remember, there was a period which brought women to a little bit of a greater position of power. It was called Republican motherhood. Women support their families during the Revolution. Women take care of the children, take care of the farm, take care of the business. And Women became the primary educators of their children, especially their sons, to raise virtuous citizens who can continue the ideas of the American Republic. However, once more and more men began to leave for work and cities began to expand, public schools began to develop, especially in the Northeast. So when people would send their children to public schools or even private schools, the role of women as their primary teacher is lost. And women lose that role as civic educators. So, what begins to happen as the middle and upper class develop throughout the market revolution, this idea of doctrine of spheres, which begins to define gender roles. Men were expected to operate in the public sphere. They were in law, they were in banking, they were in business. These pursuits could be highly charged, emotional, and they are the manly emotions that men can handle. Women, on the other hand, were expected to operate in the private sphere. They were expected to take care of the home. They were to take care of the running of the household because womanly emotions lent themselves to calm and virtuous behavior. This was what was needed in the home. And this was what was needed by the husband at the end of the day. He had a hard day in the public sphere. He needed to come home to this calm, virtuous, chaste, peaceful haven. So, cult of true womanhood, that is this unrealistic idea that is on the role of women. If you look at letter C, this is a very unrealistic idea under the cult of domesticity. True women possess the characteristics of piety, purity, chastity, and submissiveness. This is part of this cult. Middle and upper class women are judged by their families, society, and each other to see how well they could meet these virtues. So you have all of this judging upon one another. Also, to ensure that true women do not enter the public sphere because it's no place for them, the legal rights of all women, such as voting, managing money, owning property, even contraception and birth control, are stripped away and given to male guardians, usually the father or the husband. If you did not have a father or husband, it would fall to a brother, a cousin, even your son if he were old enough. So women begin to lose any sort of ground that they gained in the Revolutionary War. We know they didn't get the right to vote out of the revolution, but now they're not even really allowed out of the house without a chaperone because the public sphere is too dangerous. Remember, this was caused in part by the market revolution. Cities were getting bigger, they were getting more crowded, they were filled with immigrants who were often very different. So keep in mind, working class women, free Black women, immigrant women, such as maids or cooks, did not subscribe to the ideology of the cult of domesticity. They needed to work in the public sphere, so they were out and about. So I hope by now you are able to see how the market revolution impacted various segments of American society, such as migration, immigration, and last but not least, how it changed gender and family roles into the cult of domesticity.